So now we're going to get into just a brief overview of the brain. I say brief, this slideshow is pretty long. Bear with me, you don't need to remember all of the information in detail here. I just want to highlight what we're working with so that when these things come up later on in the course, it's a bit more familiar and it's not totally new when we start broaching different types of topics involving different brain regions. The main things that you do need to remember are just these two rules. So there are two rules about the brain that we're going to take with us throughout the entirety of this course. Number one, neurons that wire together fire together. This one works both ways, so if you forget which way around it is, it actually works the other way as well. So neurons that fire together wire together. Basically what that means is regions in the brain that are closest to each other most strongly influence each other. So let's say the region for the brain that deals with sensation of my hand is right next to the region for the brain that deals with movement of the hand. And that is because in order to effectively move my hand, my brain has to be able to feel where it is. So it might not be the skin sensation necessarily that it's feeling, but there will be some sort of proprioceptive sensation that comes up to the brain to tell my brain where my hand is so that I can move it. So these two things live right next to each other in the brain because they very often are needed to work in tandem together. And so by wiring them up very close to each other, it means they can share blood flow, they can share glucose and oxygen, and it makes it much easier to use. And that principle we'll be applying the whole way through. You know, if you have a client that struggles with something, or if you're struggling with something yourself, let's say it's to do with your breathing, and you want to figure out, well, my body's not responding to all the breathing exercises, what could we do? We could figure out which bits are nearby. So in the case of breathing, sometimes it might be our vision, sometimes it might be our balance, it could be something to do with our spine or our rib cage. If we find all the things that are most closely wired up to the breathing apparatus or to the neural processes involved in breathing, we can influence breathing without actually having to train that bit if that bit is being currently unresponsive. The second thing that we need to know is the further up the chain, the stronger the stimulus. So we're going to go on a journey from kind of like the receptors, the sensory receptors of the body, all the way up to the top of the brain, the frontal lobe of the brain. And generally, the further up this chain that you go, so the further into this presentation that you go, training these areas will give the stronger stimulus. So the first things that we're going to see are the weaker stimulus, the further up is the stronger stimulus, and what we talked about in the last lesson about plasticity, if you want to increase the intensity, then you want to start using things further up the chain. Similarly, when we talk in a couple of lessons time about threat, we might find that training the things we want to train are too threatening, and therefore we need to go down the chain closer to the beginning, closer to the start, in order to give the brain something that it's comfortable with tolerating. So the other thing to note is the further up the chain, the stronger stimulus means it's going to more greatly affect plasticity. So that's everything that we talked about in the last lesson. You want it to improve, go further up the chain, as long as the body can tolerate it. So let's go on a bit of a journey, as I said, from the receptors all the way up to the top of the brain. And the first thing that we've got, these receptors are basically anything that gives information to the brain. So these are all sensory receptors. They're all different types of ways that the brain can receive information. They can be things like motion. So if you're a strength coach or something like that, you'll be familiar maybe with muscle spindles that sense when the muscles are stretching. That would be an example of a motion receptor. Chemical receptors could be like the chemical receptors on your tongue. You've also got them on your skin. Tongue obviously is going to influence taste. Skin might be more to sense when something dangerous is in contact with your skin. Light, sound, obviously they pretty obvious sight and hearing. Touch, pressure are kind of two ends of the same coin, but all of the kind of touch sensation on your skin, there's lots of different receptors for that. Temperature and stretch. So temperature, obviously hot and cold, that can be pretty important to know. Stretch can be stretch of things like nerves and muscles and skin, so it doesn't necessarily just have to be the kind of motion stretch receptors in the muscles like we just talked about. Electrical field, that one's a little less well mapped out in terms of research and stuff, but there's strong suggestions that we're able to detect certain types of electric fields and electric frequencies, as well as fluids, so being able to detect and regulate osmosis and stuff like that in the cells. That's not all of the receptors, that's just a strong list of different types of receptors that we can have. The reason I think it's interesting to list these ones is most of us are familiar with them, but also you'll see that when we are working as, strength coaches, massage therapists, mindfulness coaches and things like that, a lot of the things that we are doing are based around this level. So, if you're a movement coach, then you're going to deal with these motion receptors and touch receptors and stretch receptors. Maybe for different types of meditation and yoga and stuff, you might look at things like temperature and chemical if you're playing with different smells, aromatherapy, for example. A massage artist obviously might be doing stuff with the touch and stretch receptors as well. A lot of the time, the paradigms that we use are specifically to affect the receptors, and when we say we work with the body, oftentimes it's very much that we're working with the sensory receptors in the body in order to influence our brain to create the changes that we want. And it should be quite telling, one of the reasons this is so successful is it's way back at the bottom of the chain. So this is the first link in the chain. We said the stimulus gets stronger as we go up the chain. So you can do quite a lot here without necessarily doing any damage. The disadvantage is in some cases, we might not be able to affect the change that we want. So maybe just influencing the receptors doesn't give us the stimulus that we need, in which case we need to go further up. So what are the receptors connected to? Next, we've got peripheral nerves. So there are three kinds of nerves that exist in the body in order to take the information from the receptors all the way up. So those would be sensory nerves. You could have nerves that give information from the brain and go all the way down. So they would be motor nerves. That's when the brain has made the decision on what to do. It's going to fire those instructions through a different set of nerves to the nerves that are sending the information up. And then as well as that, you've also got autonomic nerves, and we'll be talking more about this throughout the course because we are looking at autonomics, but these nerves control all of the physiological processes to maintain healthy function of the body. So that would be things like your heart rate, your breathing, the temperature and acidity of your cells, your lymphatic system, waste disposal of the body, all of the things that need to happen but that you don't necessarily want to be thinking of. They are sensory and they are motor, but they're connected to a different system. So they're connected to a more unconscious system so that they can keep functioning even when these sensory nerves are otherwise occupied, and the same with the motor nerves. Then we get to the spinal cord. So spinal cord essentially is just a really big, thick nerve. In fact, you could say with all these peripheral nerves and the spinal cord, really you only just have one nerve in your body. They're all just connected together, and the reason that we call them different things is it was useful to name different parts of this one big nerve to differentiate what different kinds of things can be done. So the spinal cord is going to relay all of this information between the brain and the body, so all the information comes from the nerves, and the spinal cord is the direct port of contact. Now, the interesting thing about the spinal cord is if it receives any information that is important enough, it can provide reflexive interventions. So that is like your knee-jerk reflex. When you put your hand on the hot stove, as you go further up the chain, it takes longer for this signal to be processed. So if I know that I'm touching something that is boiling hot, and the process that needed to happen was the information had to go all the way up to my brain. My brain had to then go, all right, what's happening? There's heat. What am I going to do about it? Okay, we should probably move. Let's make that happen. That's going to take a long time. Not really in terms of human perception of long, but in terms of the duration for the cells, that's going to be a long time. The cells are going to get massively damaged in the time it takes for the information to go up and then all the way back down to say move. So the spinal cord has the ability, when things are really important like that, to just provide reflexive intervention. So you put your hand on the hot stove, it bounces straight back. That movement doesn't have any grace or quality of movement. It's just automatic. You cannot control it, and that's the job of the spinal cord, is it can create movements if it really has to. All of the nerves in the body, as we've discussed, and the brain are linked to the spinal cord. So again, it might seem like, why do we bring this bit up? Because surely there's nothing we can do to influence it. We can put our spinal cord into tension. We can put our spinal cord, we can make it go a little bit slack. We can provide movement that stimulates the spinal cord. And sometimes that might be just the level of intensity needed to get the peripheral nerves or the receptors to wake up and start doing their job. Okay, now we get into the fun stuff. This is the bit where we're going to spend most of our time on this course, the brainstem. So the brainstem is responsible for regulating the autonomic processes required for survival. There's that word again, autonomic. We're going to be talking all about that in the next lesson, but all of the things that you need to do so that those autonomic nerves were doing, you know, the heart rate, the breathing, the waste disposal, the temperature regulation, any kind of recovery, digestion, anything that if you had to think about it and it didn't get done, it would be catastrophic for you. You would definitely die. Then this part of your brain, the brainstem, is going to be dealing with that. Now, you don't really need to know this right now, but I'm just bringing it up because we might talk a little bit more about it later on in the course. So it's divided into three regions. We've got the medulla, that is the lowermost part. That deals with the really basic life or death type reflexes. Then you got the pons, that deals with stuff that is very necessary but not as critical. So that would be things like being able to move your eyes and to balance upright and things like that. And then you've got the midbrain, which deals more with kind of integrating a lot of these different processes together. So examples of stuff, I've mentioned a few of them already: breathing, balance, blood pressure, organ function, heart rate, eye movement, digestive processes, posture, facial expression, and any other kind of reflexive processes, whatever they might be, you know, like your startle reflex, that kind of thing. All of those are included under the remit of the brainstem. So super important part of the brain. If it's not working, you're not working. And like I said, this is where we're going to do most of the work on this course. When we can get all of these automatic processes functioning well, it makes it much, much easier for the rest of the brain to do its job. In fact, while we said the stimulus gets more intense as we go further up the chain here, the brainstem is almost like a bit of a block in terms of fuel. So the other stimulus might be more intense, but if the brainstem doesn't have enough oxygen, or it's panicking and so it thinks that it needs more glucose and oxygen than it really does, the rest of your brain is not going to get given as much fuel, and all of that is going to be prioritized to the brainstem. So when you get the brainstem functioning well, you make it much easier for everything else in the brain to function well, and we'll talk about that much more in the next lesson. Okay, then we move up a little bit from the brainstem and we get to the occipital lobe. This is responsible for pretty much all of the parts of vision that are involved in building a picture that you see. Okay, so vision's a weird one because it takes up about 50% of your entire brain is somehow related to vision. So the occipital lobe is not vision entirely, it's just the bit that actually builds the picture that you see. The visual image produced doesn't actually match the reality of the world, okay? So your eyes take in the sensory information, and then your brain just starts photoshopping it and chopping it up in a way that is more useful to you. So that's why we can recognize faces and things that don't really have faces, because the occipital lobe is doing all of its processing going, well, that looks like it could be a face, and in nature, if something actually is a face and you miss it, that could be dangerous for you. That could be a snake or something that's got camouflage, and so it's always safer for you to start noticing things that could be alive and out to get you, for example. There's other types of processes that the occipital lobe does to change the visual image before you see it. I think they're all very fascinating. We'll definitely talk about a bunch of them as we go through the course, but for now, just like all the visual illusions that you experience visual illusions because you do not see the world as it really is. And again, this is another one that gets processed pretty much unconsciously, and there's not a whole lot that you can do to change it. The interesting thing with the occipital lobe is if you want to be fast at decision making, at actual movement, a lot of the speed at which you can process the visual picture greatly impacts the speed that you can process other activities. So if you can see the world, process that information, figure out what it means, the quicker you can do that, the quicker you can react to it. And so when it comes to speed, a lot of people are training fast twitch fibers and muscles like that. That's certainly important, but if you can't actually react to the visual picture of the world, and vision being our strongest sense, tends to be the more important one, then you're going to have trouble no matter how fast your muscles are capable of moving. Okay, moving further up the chain now. Around about here, it gets a little confusing as to which actually is further up the chain. A lot of these regions of the brain are near each other, and there can be certain bits that are closer than others, but for now we're going in this order. The temporal lobe is most commonly associated, so it sits down by your ears. It's most commonly associated with some aspects of memory, particularly short-term memory, and identification. So being able to figure out what things are is the temporal lobe. You might see something and you know that it's really familiar and you just can't work out where you've seen it before or what it is. That is temporal lobe not working as well as it potentially could, either because it cannot find the name of the thing, or it might be misfiring and telling you that this is familiar. So this is an issue I deal with a lot with faces, is I see faces and I see them as very familiar, but actually I've never seen that person before in my life. And this is the temporal lobe just going, this is probably something you need to be paying attention to, but it can't tell me what it is because it's not a real memory. So in addition to this, the temporal lobe also plays a large role in speech and language. That kind of makes sense with memory. If one of the big parts of language is you have to remember a huge list of vocabulary and grammar and all of that, you don't consciously learn the grammar, you just pick it up. But the temporal lobe is the bit that is processing and storing all of that information. And then that means it also affects your speech as well. Sound and hearing is the other thing quite commonly associated with the temporal lobe. So, when you listen to music, the brainstem is making the ears actually work, but then the actual sound information is going to the temporal lobe to be processed. Moving on from there, we've got the parietal lobe, so it sits just above. It's kind of right at the top of the head, behind where you would put a hairband. The parietal lobe is the main lobe for processing sensory information. So a lot of the information from your senses are going to come to the parietal lobe. Touch is the big one. You have the sensory cortex, which deals with all different types of touch all around your body, but it also deals with other senses. In fact, all the other senses to some degree. Taste is another big one that gets processed there. Another role, given that touch and touch being a big part of bodily awareness and proprioception, another big role of the parietal lobe is spatial awareness, so being able to figure out where you are in the environment and where other things are in the environment. So you got the temporal lobe will tell you what something is, but then the second part of the puzzle is you also need to know where it is if you're going to interact with it, and the parietal lobe is going to deal with that. Okay, then we've got, this one's interesting, so we've got the limbic system, and this is not necessarily in front of the temporal or parietal lobe, it's more further inside. And you could argue that actually its place belongs closer to the brainstem in terms of the chain. I like to put it here because it works very closely with the next region that we're going to talk about. But the limbic system, you may have heard of it, its big job is processing and regulating emotions, okay? And then on top of that, learning and motivation. Well, what is emotion? Emotion is just how you react to specific learning. So the goal of the limbic system is to create a general overview or vibe of the environment based on past and current information. So that's why learning plays a part, is if you've put yourself into an environment, your brain is going to take in all of the information about your body, about the world around you, and then it's going to say, right, have I experienced this at any time before? So maybe you're hearing a certain sound that matches when you happen to be in a car accident, like you hear crunching or somebody shouting very loud, and the limbic system is going to go, well, that matches something really bad that happened. And maybe you hear another thing that might be a trigger for something really positive, and there's going to be thousands of bits of information coming in all at once, and then the limbic system is going to gather and basically say, based on everything I learned before, we're either in a biased positive situation or a biased negative situation, and then it's going to find the correct emotions for you to be feeling based on that. So it could be something like happiness, joy, or on the negative aspect, it could be depression or anxiety or pain or something like that. Those emotions, or any combination of those emotions, are decided based on the kind of positive or negative weight of certain pieces of information coming from your environment. Other interesting thing about the limbic system is that it also is strongly linked with smell. That might seem obvious. Most smells, you either like them or you hate them, or if it's a neutral smell, you usually just tune it out. You don't notice it at all after about a minute or two. Smell is really closely linked with the limbic system, just because a strong positive or a strong negative smell is usually pretty decisive. Like if it smells really bad, or if the smell is really strongly associated with something bad, very likely that bad thing is about to happen again. There's not a whole load of times where you can have positive experiences associated with things that create the kinds of smells that your limbic system associates as bad. Hope that made sense. It was a bit waffly maybe. Okay, moving on from the limbic system, finally we've got to the frontal lobe. We're going to talk about one other region afterwards. The frontal lobe of the brain, as the name suggests, sits right at the front. And the frontal lobe of the brain is the region, in humans, it's kind of considered the most developed. It's the bit that we do a lot of research on. Sometimes it is considered the lobe of human function. You'll find people that will argue against that and argue for that. Just wanted to let you know. The big things the frontal lobe are going to do is voluntary movement and executive function. Okay, so anytime you decide to move, the frontal lobe is the bit that is going to make that happen. So it's not like your startle reflex or your heartbeat or your breathing that is happening unconsciously. Could be your breathing when you voluntarily think about it, but it's not one of the things happening unconsciously. It's stuff like lifting your arm, throwing the ball, going for a run. Those kinds of things, the frontal lobe is going to deal with that. The second part, executive function, that is all of the things that we might consider a bit more human-like. Our ability to make decisions, weigh up the options, decide which is the best one. Our ability to focus on things and ignore distractions. So deciding what is important and then sticking with that and ignoring all the distractions around us. Or it could be... I forgot the third one. It could be inhibiting things. So instead of just avoiding distractions, it could be getting emotional stimulus, like something really bad is about to happen, or I'm feeling depressed, and saying, look, we don't have time for this now. I'm going to switch that emotion off, and I'm just going to hold it back so that we can go and do something, because consciously I know that this is more important. So it has inhibition of anything. You got the urge to go to McDonald's, well, the frontal lobe is the one that will switch that off. This should be interesting because we kind of talked about the brainstem taking up lots of fuel, and the frontal lobe it's much further up the chain, so it's a really strong stimulus. Well, strong stimulus also means it uses up a lot of energy. And if it uses up a lot of energy, then as the energy runs out, it's going to start to fatigue. So these bits, voluntary movement and executive function, are going to fatigue much quicker than anything else that we've talked about. And what does that look like? Well, we said inhibiting, you want to go for a McDonald's, your brain sees all the triggers for fast food, and it starts engaging the processes of hunger and digestion, and the limbic system is going to put you in a good mood to make you more motivated to go and get the fast food, and the frontal lobe says, no, don't do that, we're not going to do that, I know it's not something I want for myself, I want to be healthy, whatever. Well, the more you're inhibiting things, the more the frontal lobe is going to run out of energy, and then eventually you kind of run out of fuel, and then that's why we find ourselves giving into these kind of cravings and urges so much. Same voluntary movements. Posture is something that would be regulated by the brainstem, just because it's something we naturally need to do, but we can override our posture by standing up straight, which would be a form of voluntary movement. Over time, that's going to deplete and run out, and then we're going to find that as we get more and more tired throughout the day, our posture gets worse and worse. And this is one of the reasons why the brainstem is going to be much more useful for improving people's posture than just consciously thinking about how we stand, because this region of the brain just cannot stay active for so very long. So that's the frontal lobe. There is one more area of the brain, and it doesn't really match this kind of a pattern that we've been building. We kind of went from the body, and then we went all the way up the spinal cord from the bottom of the brain, and then kind of fed all the way forward to the front. Well, the strongest stimulus that we're going to get actually sits all the way back here at the back, next to the brainstem, and it's a part of the brain called the cerebellum. It's one of the really interesting ones, because for ages, scientists just assumed it didn't really do anything, and anytime you look into science history, especially about the human body, where they say, oh yeah, we don't think this really has a modern day purpose, usually that ends up being ridiculously wrong. And so we now know that the cerebellum, again, this bit right at the back of the brain, stuck onto that brainstem, which is what's dealing with all of our autonomic stuff, it can have anywhere between 50% to 80% of all of the neurons in the brain. So neurons were like the brain cells that make things happen. And so just imagine that, 50%, it's this tiny little space, so it's really densely packed, whereas the rest of the brain, everything's spaced out a little bit, and so there's a bit more space for things to travel. If things get damaged, it doesn't do such a huge amount of damage. The cerebellum, on the other hand, everything is super, super densely packed, which would suggest to you that it should be really, really important, and it turns out, yes, it is. The reason, I guess, scientists probably thought it didn't do anything is it doesn't seem to have its own specific function. It's not dealing with hearing, it's not dealing with creating a visual picture, it's not dealing with autonomic processes, it deals with everything. And the way you can think about it is kind of like this feedback loop, in that one region of the brain decides to do something, And then the cerebellum has to figure out if you're doing it right. It has to, it basically acts as like the micromanager, where it sits on top, and any region of the brain that tries to execute a function, it's going to then start tweaking things to make sure that they're going in the right way. That's really, really useful. That's one of the reasons that humans and other animals can learn so many things later in life, and they don't come out pre-programmed like an insect, because you've got all these regions of the brain that can give commands, but then the cerebellum can say, hey, you're not doing these commands right. And it could be because the environment has changed. So, you're throwing a ball, but then it's heavy wind and you have to throw the ball a different way. It could be because you have changed. So as you grow and get taller, you wouldn't want to be still trying to throw the ball the same way as you did when you had shorter, stubbier arms. And so all of the things that change, the cerebellum has to figure out what's going on, what's happening differently in different parts of the body, what's happening differently in different parts of the environment, and just reorganize everything and reorganize the movements that we're doing to make sure that they happen in a precise and coordinated manner. So it's a really cool part of the brain. This is the other region that we're going to talk about and deal with a lot, because this is one part where if we can get this functioning really, really well, then our movement potential is going to increase by a long way. So that is all of the information about the brain overview, brain regions. Like I said, you don't need to remember even the names of all the regions. We'll briefly be touching on them throughout the course, so I thought it'd be interesting to introduce you to them. But those first two rules are the bits that are important. So the regions that are nearby, that are next to each other, influence each other. Okay, that's what I was talking about a little bit in the last video as well, that you might be trying to work on your anxiety, which isn't a movement in itself. But if you can figure out which parts of the brain are closely associated to it, you can find movements that could potentially help. And the same goes for everything, is it your ability to work out math or chess patterns? You can find movements that will increase blood flow to those regions of the brain, and then you can find that you can influence those regions of the brain much, much better. Then the second bit was that the further up the chain that we went there, the more intense the stimulus and the greater the influence on plasticity. That's just something to keep in mind. If you want to make something harder, think, what can you add in further up the chain? So you might just be looking at bicep curls, but it could be bicep curls with executive function and decision making. So you could have rules for when you have to stop, when you have to go, how fast that you move. You could have rules that you have to avoid something. I could be moving my hand in and then you got to try and avoid that. It could be bicep curls to sound, so when you hear certain noises, you have to do the curl, and that would be more influencing the temporal lobe. There's loads of different ways that you could play with that and combine simple movements that deal with the receptors of the body, but then add in other parts of the brain, and we will look at that later on in the course.